Hello and welcome to History by Hollywood, a podcast series that examines the real events and people behind fact-based movies. This is episode 52 for Sunday the 7th of April 2019, and this week we're looking at The Right Stuff, detailing the American efforts to break the sound barrier and then the first forays into space. It's a big movie, so we do have a big episode. And joining me for this show is Sean Munger, host of the Second Decade podcast that you will have all heard us rave about. There will be a link to Sean's podcast website in the show notes. And Sean is the son of a US Air Force pilot, so he has a personal perspective on much of this film. My name is Martin Darlington, and with me, at least for the introduction stage, is Andrew Blischik. Hello, Andrew.
Hello, Martin. Good to hear your voice again. Let's get things started with an errata/update. Thanks to the magic of the History by Hollywood time machine, we can preempt one particular errata. During the show you're about to listen to, Martin describes John Glenn as the oldest man who has yet been into space, and this is correct, but Martin also suggested that it was John Glenn who, well into his old age, punched an aggressive conspiracy theorist who asked him why he was helping to perpetuate a lie, mainly the moon landing. This was an error, as the astronaut who threw the punch was not John Glenn, but as Sean suggested that you're about to hear, it was actually Buzz Aldrin, the second man on the moon, who took great umbrage at suggesting that the moon landing was a conspiracy, and good on him.
Yeah. After several emails from listeners requesting that we cover Breaker Morant, the Boer War era movie starring Edward Woodward and Brian Brown, we've decided to do just that. It's probably going to be late summer, so do keep an eye on the planned episodes page, which is now the website's homepage. And talking of the Boer War, through the recommendation of Nick Parkinson, friend of the show and listener and great emailer, Nick recommended the Anglo-Boer War podcast hosted by Des Latham. It's a very well presented series. Des has a great storyteller's manner about him, and it's very highly recommended. And again, we'll put a link to Des's website on the show notes to this episode. We have been in touch with Des, and there may be a future collaboration on the cards.
Excellent. And when Martin says we'll probably tackle Breaker Morant late in the summer, he means, of course, northern summer, where it'll be winter, where I'll be in the southern hemisphere.
Oops, sorry.
Yeah, for Breaker Morant, I thought I might just sort of remind the Southern Hemisphere movie, I suppose.
I'm being hemispherist.
Also, after a recent email from a listener that we have insufficient pictures on the website, we're going to be posting some movie posters, pictures and maps on many of the existing episode pages. Plus, make sure we add similar images and graphics for future episodes. Go to the blue links at the bottom of each page to visit an individual episode's page for the additional upcoming information.
Also, after Andrew's excellent coverage of 1967's Bonnie and Clyde last time out, I actually on the plane, I've just been home to the UK for a week, on the plane back out, I watched The Highwayman, a newly released Netflix movie with Kevin Costner and Woody Harrelson as two retired Texas Rangers who were tasked to track down Bonnie and Clyde. These were real people. The Kevin Costner character is genuinely one of the most celebrated Texas Rangers of all time.
Hamer,
and it's Yeah, that's him, Hamer. And it's fascinating to see the movie. It takes a totally different track to the original. I won't go into detail, but it's a real juxtaposition from the focus of the 67 movie. Very highly recommended, definitely one for us in the very near future. It was recommended to us by two listeners, Phil Pomerantz, who sent us another wonderful email, and he also reminisced about living near air bases and hearing jets taking off as his walls shook in anticipation of this episode that we're doing today, and Sean's experiences. We also heard from Gary Shavit, who Gary always does his homework, at least on movies that don't star Madonna, and continues to be a great supporter of our efforts. And both Phil and Gary recommended The Highwayman. And I didn't even know about it. I hadn't heard about that film until they emailed in. So thank you guys. Thank you very much.
Thanks to both of you. We do have one review to update everybody. It's from a Joe Denise from the USA, and he posted on March 26th, 2019. Excellent history podcast! Joe says, I just started to listen to the podcast a few months back. I finally caught up and enjoy the insights on what is fact or fiction with these movies. A suggestion for future movies, Gettysburg plus American Sniper. Keep up the good work. Now, Martin, we've had both of those mentioned before as possibles.
Yeah, both of them definitely movies on the long list for the future. Gettysburg is, I think, a 4-hour film. I've seen it. I saw it years ago. Very high production values, very well done. American Sniper,
Right.
I have seen. It gives quite a nuanced view of the guy himself, Chris, the sniper, and it definitely polarizes opinion. So again, yeah, that generates debate. So definitely ones for us. We've also heard from David Amble, listener and previous correspondent. David also requested Breaker Morant, which is incredible. The attention this film that I'd never heard of till you mentioned it, Andrew, has generated. So that's why we're doing it soon. He also suggested Bridge on the River Kwai. Now I replied to David and basically explained Bridge on the River Kwai will get covered, but in a supplementary, in the next supplementary that we do for the ones that got away. So these are films based in a historical framework, but the central theme of Bridge on the River Kwai, which I'm sure most of the listeners are familiar with, is of British POWs captured by the Japanese and used
Right.
as labour in Burma, which is all true. What actually happens in the movie, where they're building a bridge and decide to build it as best as they damn well can and show these Japanese what the British are made of, before realising they're actually aiding the Japanese war effort, that's fictional. So a bit like Private Ryan and Titanic, there's a historical framework, but the actual main story is fictional. Now our next episode, which segues nicely into previewing that, is Gallipoli. We are aware that the two main characters in Gallipoli are fictional. However, the actions they're portrayed as carrying out in the movie are what thousands of men did. You know, that they don't go off on some side story, which is fictional. So it's a subtle difference, but it's a significant one, and that's what gets Gallipoli into
The list.
the main episode list. Yeah, exactly. And of course,
Great.
we'll be putting that one out. I think it's the 21st of April, and within a few days is Anzac Day in New Zealand and Australia, which is hugely significant culturally to both countries. And now, on with the show. Unfortunately, we've been served a copyright infringement notice by Warner Brothers, and so the YouTube version is going to be without the intro music or the outro music. We do apologise. If you'd like to hear the full version, you can find it on iTunes, Podbean, SoundCloud, or through the website historybyhollywood.com. So I'm delighted to introduce Sean Munger, the host of the Second Decade podcast that you will have heard Andrew and I rave about for quite some time now. And Sean joins me all the way from Northwest America. And good morning to you, Sean.
Good morning, Martin. Thank you very much for having me on. I love your show. Been listening, kind of binge listening for the last couple of weeks, and really been enjoying it. So I love the opportunity to come on.
No, fantastic. And if anyone hasn't listened, there will be a link to Sean's show, the Second Decade podcast, in the show notes and to the website. And it's absolutely fascinating, the intense activity globally that happened between 1810 and 1820. And one thing I've wanted to ask you really since I started listening to the show was, what led you to that period? Was there any particular thing you read about, or a number, and then you thought, wow, a lot happened?
Well, really, it came out of my academic study. At the time that I created the podcast, I was still working on my PhD, which is principally in environmental history. And my dissertation was on, I'm going to say the year without summer, but avid listeners of the show will know that it was much bigger than just 1 year. Of course, we're talking about the effect of Tambora.
1816?
Right, 1816, and Tambora, the volcano that erupted and shrouded the earth in a veil of volcanic dust and caused a lot of strange weather and a period of temporary climate change, really. So I was researching that, and it turns out that it was really a whole decade, because there had been a previous eruption of a mountain that we don't know about in 1809 that had kind of pushed the Earth's climate into like an almost changed state, and then Tambora finally kind of pushed it over the edge.
Yeah.
But I was researching, doing lots and lots of research for my dissertation, and I spent a month in residence at the Huntington Library in Southern California, and then the Massachusetts Historical Society in Boston, looking at primary sources dealing with the weather, for example, diaries of people talking about what the weather was like, and like the actual handwritten diaries from that time, and it was just so fascinating. So, but there was so much that I had to kind of leave on the cutting room floor, so to speak, because it didn't really fit in my dissertation, which is about how people thought about the environment and the climate. But there was so much fascinating stuff that I couldn't just, read it and then leave it alone.
Yeah,
so
walk away from it. Yeah.
Right. So, maybe I'll start a podcast and I can bring in some of those interesting little stories that I found. And so it started kind of snowballing from there. And it's like, well, if I'm going to do the decade, I have to talk about Napoleon. I have to talk about the War of 1812. There's all this stuff I have to do.
Yeah.
But a great example of some of my dissertation research that did not end up getting used in my dissertation or used very much, but became a really great episode is episode 14, Down and Out at Harvard.
Where, yeah. These kids who went and left diaries and letters, and incredible.
Yeah, it was so fascinating, and that's still to this day my all-time favorite episode of the podcast. One of the kids, and there's two kids that are profiled in that episode. One of them published his memoirs or he didn't, he was dead, but his memoirs were published in the 19-teens.
Yeah.
But then the other guy I talk about, Aaron White, his memoirs have never been published, and they are, in fact, in the Massachusetts Historical Society archives. And I had to get permission from them, which they granted happily, to quote on the podcast. But I remember being in the MHS reading room, and there's a joke that Aaron White says something about, like, everybody makes fun of my legs or something like that, and I remember laughing out loud at just the kind of wry humor that people had at that time.
Yeah.
So it was this quiet reading room with all these portraits of, New England patricians kind of looking down on you, and the reading room at the Massachusetts Historical Society looks like the first class smoking room on the Titanic. So it's all this paneled stuff and everything, and I'm just kind of chortling at this teenager from 200 years ago who's writing in his diary. So that's just sort of the magic stuff that I found. And I really did become, as I was doing my dissertation research, I really became a believer in how crucial this decade was in world history.
Yeah, I mean, it's really pivotal. And not just in Europe, not just in America, like all over the world, there was stuff going on that really, as you said in one of the episodes, I think, we think of the Industrial Revolution as a big change. Well, this kind of set the scene for that, created the environment for that to exist.
Right, exactly.
Obviously, I mean, most people who look at history understand that technology advances most during conflict, and there was an awful lot of conflict going on around that time.
Yeah, that's true. A world war really was happening.
Yeah, it was amazing.
So and trying to get the other pieces of the world represented on the show is also something that was very important to me, because my dissertation did have kind of a worldwide focus, but it was just because the sources were very heavily based in U.S. and English speaking world, basically. So after I finished my PhD during the time that the show has been on, so I've moved on to other subjects, but trying to do things like the Dawn of the Zulu episode,
about that was fascinating.
Sub-Saharan Africa, and then I did a history of Australia, which was super fascinating and bizarre, so bizarre, that story.
Yeah, because I'd never really thought about it in depth, and obviously Andrew's Australian, a co-host, and we've had brief discussions about your show when we've been talking. And Andrew was a neighbour here in Qatar, but they moved home in the autumn. And you think, so what was the original idea? Just send to the other side of the world and see if there's any natural resources to mine, and then that was it McGowan, the governor, the commanding officer of the infantry,
Macquarie,
Macquarie. And he went there and said, no, we need to make this a sustainable, living community. And you think, wow. I mean, I'm sure there are Aboriginals who are rather unhappy that he took that view and wish they'd all just sort of gone away. But and really hostile environment. I mean, the amount of things that want to kill you in Australia is incredible.
Yeah.
Snakes, jellyfish, sharks, crocodiles, spiders. I'm sure Steve Irwin, bless him, once said that 9 of the world's 10 most venomous land snakes live in Australia. And you think, wow.
Not surprised.
Yeah.
Well, and just such odd little details, like when I was researching that and found out that convicts, when they escaped from the penal colony and tried to go over the mountains, they thought that Australia was connected to China. So they thought they were going to escape overland to China and then sail home from Canton or something. And of course, they all died in the desert. And
oh dear. Whoops.
But just weird little details like that I had never, and I knew nothing about the history of Australia before I started researching that episode. So it's amazing what you learn.
Yeah, it's fab, and I absolutely thoroughly recommend it. It went straight to the top of my listening list, and but now I'm having to wait for your next episode to come out. So stop talking to me and go and do one.
Yeah, I'm on kind of an unplanned hiatus. There's so much going on in my life right now. But I am going to return to the show, and I've had a long-standing promise to do an episode on the history of Antarctica, which was definitively quote-unquote discovered by Europeans supposedly in 1820, but there was also some previous activity going on in the second decade around Antarctica, which is really, really fascinating. So that's going to be my next episode.
Oh, look forward to that. Now, you also write books. You've got an author page on Amazon, which we'll also provide a link to, and a really interesting range of books. But to segue nicely into our coverage today of The Right Stuff, which is a movie I grew up absolutely loving and just watched it at the cinema on its initial release. And I remember telling friends it was really good, and they went to watch it and said, no, it's not on anymore. It was only on for like 5 days. This was in Cambridge in the UK. Mm-hmm. And reading it, it's like, financially it was a flop on its initial release, which is really strange. But one of the things that really led us to bring you in for this show was you grew up on dusty desert Air Force bases like Edwards, didn't you? I'm fascinated to find out what it was like to be a kid with your dad in the Air Force, in these sorts of places.
Yeah, it was a really interesting childhood. My father was a career Air Force officer, and we didn't actually live on base, but we often lived close to bases, and friends lived on base and things like that. But growing in the Air Force really is a culture and a lifestyle, and it's depicted, I think, so perfectly in the movie. They got the tenor of what it was like to be, particularly an Air Force wife, and they don't go into kids as much, but there's so much commonality there. And there's it makes me sound sentimental, but there's still scenes where I cry in The Right Stuff because it's like, oh my God, that's my mom, and my early childhood, my dad joined the Air Force actually before Vietnam. And eventually went through the flight training program. He actually flew tankers, KC-135s in Vietnam. Yeah. And I was born during the Vietnam War. So my early memories kind of pick up in the late 70s, about 20 years after the events shown in The Right Stuff. But very little had changed between those two times.
And of course, I mean, specifically Air Force, and I mean, for me, once I joined the Army Air Corps, less so, but generally, military airfields are normally away from centres of population because of the noise, which means that socialising, you really have no choice but to socialise with the other Air Force wives, the other Air Force husbands. The Air Force kids will have knocked them out with other Air Force kids. So you really are a tight little community. I think more so than the Army, and in a different way with the Navy, where in those days, women not going to sea, I guess it was the wives' club was really important for the families, as the dads would be away on ships. or husbands would be away on ships. So, but yeah, fascinating.
Yeah, well, that did happen in the Air Force as well, because often, like I remember, my dad was often away for long periods of time, months at a time, on what they called TDY, temporary duty,
Yeah.
often in Europe. So that was similar to the way that
Yeah.
the ship rotations in the Navy, and there were months where our house was just my mom and my sister and me, and so it was, there was a lot of that going on too.
And Sharon and I met after I left the army, so she was spared those. Husband goes away for a 6-month tour, but you had the situation. We'd come back from Bosnia or Northern Ireland or wherever it would be, and the wife would be like, "Oh, thank goodness for that. At last I got some help with the kids." And the dad's getting back, the husband's getting back, going, "Oh, thank goodness for that. Now I can kick back and relax." What? You want me to help? And
Yeah.
the British Army have actually got pretty good in the last few years at giving counselling, and not counselling, but guidance on, look, he's going to come back and think he's earned the right to put his feet up and do nothing. You're going to be sat there thinking, no, you've earned the right to come back and help raise your kids because you've been away for 6 months. It was, it can be quite difficult, and it takes a special kind of person on both sides of that, that sort of marriage. And of course, we've got a lot of mums in the army now who are going away on tours, and it's challenging. But
Yeah.
we should,
Yeah.
I suppose, launch into the movie, and I think we should lead in with a snip of Bill Conti's just magnificent score, for which he did win an Oscar, I'm glad to say, and we'll come to that in a moment. So, starting off as ever with the story of the movie. Released in 1983, the movie was based on Tom Wolfe's book of the same name. Directed by Philip Kaufman, the score was written by Bill Conti, and it starred a host of known names. The movie was long, ambitious, and it appears to have made every effort it could to be as accurate as possible, with technical advisors from NASA and quite a lot of input from the surviving astronauts themselves. It cost what appears to be a fairly modest $27 million to make, partly because they did get an awful lot of support, I believe, from NASA and particularly, not Cape Canaveral, Houston, I think, the Space Center. But initially, as we mentioned earlier, it only took $21 million at domestic box office, so for some reason, worldwide figures aren't available, but domestically in the US, it kind of counts as a flop. However, it was nominated for eight Oscars, including Best Picture. It won 4, but it kind of missed out on the traditionally seen big ones, because the ones it got were for editing, sound editing, and the original score for Bill Conti, as we mentioned earlier. Best Movie went to Terms of Endearment. Sam Shepard had...
It's a terrible film.
Yeah, I've never seen it.
Don't bother.
Isn't it very sort of smulchy? Very...
Yeah, it's really not good.
No. Sam Shepard had been nominated for his portrayal of Chuck Yeager, but he was beaten by Jack Nicholson for Best Supporting Actor in Terms of Endearment. So do you want to take it from there, Sean? Because the box office returns don't really reflect most people's view of the film, do they?
No, they don't. It is, I think, deservedly regarded as a classic. The Rotten Tomatoes score is 98%, and from critics, 90% from audiences, and that puts it right up there with the best films of the last quarter century or 30, 40 years. Goodfellas, Schindler's List, that kind of thing. So, and I do note that it was inducted into the Library of Congress Movie Hall of Fame as culturally significant in American history, which is kind of unusual for a film that was a box office flop. So there's something there that people have not that people recognize now that they perhaps may not have recognized at the time.
Yeah, I mean the cast are great, and something I've always noticed that, and this is complete coincidental trivia, but Sam Shepard plays Chuck Yeager. Scott Glenn plays Alan Shepard, and Ed Harris plays John Glenn. There's a weird kind of name linking, but I love Scott Glenn as an actor, but Ed Harris has always been. I've never seen Ed Harris in a film where, even if the film itself isn't that great, I haven't enjoyed his performance. To me, he's the epitome of the kind of... He would have made a classic cowboy in the John Ford, great westerns. Mm-hmm. He's got humour, but he's tough without being willingly violent. But you get the feeling. Mm-hmm. I mean, we've just done Beautiful Mind, and he plays the DOD agent William Parcher, and you kind of, there's this tough reassurance to him. You think, yeah, if I'm stood in a trench, I'll have Ed Harris next to me. Thanks very much. Mm. Yeah, it's strange. So, into the movie and the opening scenes, we see a dusty desert bar with a group of pilots and other types bantering about breaking the sound barrier. Some are saying, it can't be done. People have said it can't be done. There's a wall, it's a physical barrier. And a group of officials with an Air Force officer in tow approach Chuck Yeager, played by Sam Shepard, who we hear is a World War II fighter ace. He shot down 5 German aircraft in a single day. And they tell him that they think the X-1 is ready and ask if he's willing to give breaking Mach 1 a go. And he just looks at him and says, yeah, when do we start? Now, we're then told it's October the 14th, 1947, so only just over 2 years after the end of the Second World War, and we see a B-29 take off with a small X-1 prototype held in its bomb bay, and Glennis Yeager, and Chuck Yeager's wife, played by Barbara Hershey, waves them off. And he didn't have an injury. He'd fallen off his horse, I think, in the movie, and one of his crew chiefs, he bodges him a bit of broom handle so he can close the hatch because he can't raise his arm or something. So he sits into the belly of the bomber. He ignites the booster rockets as he's dropped from the bomber and hurtles through the sky in the little X-1, which, if anyone's seen, is an extraordinary aircraft for a supersonic aircraft because it hasn't got swept wings, which is delta wings generally indicates that it's something that can go supersonic. But anyway, people on the ground hear a boom, and it's quite a moving moment because you can see them all look at each other and think, oh no, it's gone wrong. But actually, what they've just heard is the first sonic boom. Well, it's not the first sonic boom because people would have heard bullets creating sonic booms before then, but they probably didn't know what the crack was. So anyway, they're jubilant, and Yeager's fellow test pilots realise that they're celebrating with him, but at the same time, they've been beaten to the prize because it's only ever going to be one person who breaks the sound barrier first. So, Sean, how did they do on that?
I think generally pretty well. There's really a lot to unpack here. I mean, the basic story of how the sound barrier was broken, I think, is fairly accurate. Just a couple of, I like some of the little details that they got right. The Dusty Bar at Edwards was actually a real place. It was called Pancho's Happy Bottom Riding Club. They actually make reference to that later on, in that when the recruiters are coming there, they mentioned the name of it.
I missed that.
It was a real place. Yeah, it's when they're driving up and they get the jackets wrong.
Yeah,
it's in that little bit. But this was a real place, and it was more than just a bar. There was also a hotel there and a swimming pool and various other things. And it was run by Pancho Barnes, the kind of tough lady behind the bar. She was a barnstormer in the 1920s.
Right.
And was kind of a rival of Amelia Earhart, actually. So
wow,
she had an interesting story of her own. But
because when she hits the lines of saying there's your prime pilots and then there's your pud knockers, what are you pud knockers going to get? I didn't realise until you just said that. I didn't realise that she was actually a pilot herself.
Oh yeah, she was very famous in the 1920s, and so many people. The 1920s was really, especially in the United States, was really the era of when aviation kind of exploded because so many planes had been built for the First World War, and then were not used, and pilots were trained, and then they didn't know what to do with these planes, and the pilots couldn't get work, and so it's like, oh, well, let's start giving rides, and we'll do barnstorming, and these aerial stunts and things like that, and Pancho Barnes came out of that milieu. So,
Wow.
Interesting story from her.
Yeah.
The little bit about the horse accident, that is true, and that that Yeager did have to close the hatch with a broom handle. There's a sort of a tagline that's spoken at the two characters. There's Yeager, and then there's Jack Ridley, who reappears later in the film.
Yeah.
But there's the tagline, hey Ridley, you got any Beemans? That refers to Beeman's chewing gum, which was a type of chewing gum that was popular among airmen of that era, and that there's a callback to that later on.
And through the film, yeah, it almost becomes like a little luck ritual that they do, isn't it?
Yeah.
So, okay, great. Back to the movie. Chuck Yeager and his mates are celebrating. We cut to a car blasting along a desert road. It's now 1953, and we meet Gordo Cooper, played by an ever-grinning Dennis Quaid, and his wife Trudy, played by Pamela Reed, and their kids are also on board. And we hear Gordo state, they're going higher and faster at Edwards Air Force Base than anywhere else, and he's cocky, but when they arrive, his wife really isn't impressed with the slightly ramshackle house they've been allocated. Going outside, Trudy sees a plume of smoke in the distance, and next we see a funeral with the missing man formation. If anyone's not aware, it's like it's 5 aircraft in a V formation, but they only have 4 aircraft, so it's like a missing man. It's a fly-past tradition that I believe is specifically American, where it's sort of saying one of our guys is missing. The RAF used to do something similar, where they set a place at dinner for someone who was no longer there, and then they drink a toast to him, and their glasses got thrown into the hearth so it could never be used again. So then Gordo walks into the dusty bar, and he meets Gus Grissom, played by Fred Ward, and this is where they enter into banter with Pancho Barnes, and she really puts him in their place. And there's photographs behind the bar, aren't there? And he says, hey, maybe one day you're going to have our photographs up there. And we realise by then that the photographs of the people behind the bar are the pilots who've died. So she just raises an eyebrow at them. It's a brilliant expression. It's a great little scene. And she's like, really? You don't really want to have your photograph up there? But I believe they've done a bit of time compression there.
Yes, they have. They've put the future astronauts in proximity with each other at the same time, where, in fact, in 1953, Cooper was serving in Germany, so he wasn't even there until later. And then both he and Grissom arrived at Edwards in 1956, so it was a couple of years later.
Right.
These scenes, these early scenes at Edwards really strike kind of closer to home for me than really any other in the movie, particularly when the scenes when they're going into the house, and it's just a cinder block, box with very few amenity, and that's exactly what base housing was like in the 80s.
Yeah,
I mean, not just the early 50s. And when she turns on the tap and the water comes out all brown, that is so totally accurate. Base housing is virtually like slums. I mean, there are, at least at the time. I don't know if it's improved. I suspect it hasn't, but.
Yeah, don't worry. The Americans didn't have the monopoly on slum housing for their forces. We suffered from things very similar. In fact, in Germany, the quality was much higher. But some of the barracks in the UK, which dated back to, the married quarters, dated back decades and decades, and really hadn't been properly looked after. I do believe things have improved dramatically in the last 10 or 20 years. They waited till I left before they made them better. Okay, so back to the movie, and we see the new guys. This is Gordo Cooper and Gus Grissom, and a couple of other mates, and they're barbecuing with the wives in the garden. They look across to where Chuck Yeager's in his garden. He's throwing a baseball with his kid, and they say, wow, and they refer to him as, oh, that's old Yeager. So that every time anyone goes up and breaks his speed record, he just goes back up and wins it back again, the fastest man alive. And then the wives talk, and it's a really poignant scene as we realise the real hell they go through every time their husbands go flying. Bearing in mind these guys are test pilots, so they're flying experimental aircraft, they're trying out new manoeuvres, they're trying to find, as they keep saying, pushing the edge of the envelope and then just pulling it back in. And then we see a newsreel report that Scott Crossfield has broken Mach 2, so Chuck Yeager just goes straight back up and breaks it again. Yeah, and didn't he spoil some kind of some anniversary of the Wright brothers flight, I think you said?
Yeah, there's a brief reference to that in the movie where they talk about there's one of the newsreel things, and they're talking about the 50th anniversary of the Wright brothers flight, and Crossfield was supposed to have a celebration where the press was gonna laud him as the fastest man alive, and then Yeager just went up I think that day and broke his record, so that kind of spoiled it.
Dope.
Yeah, I love the scene again. The scene where the wives are talking about the danger that their husbands are in. This is a really difficult scene for me to watch every time I see this film, because it really does hit home. And
yeah,
especially where one of the wives talks about her friends, their husbands work on Wall Street, and it's like they're always boasting about, oh, this is a really tough business, and it's like, these guys have a 1 in 4 chance of, dying at work every day, and it's crazy. So there are things that happen, and the wives are, every time the husbands leave, it's there could be something happening. My father flew U-2s for part of his career.
Yeah.
The spy planes, and he has some such interesting stories about that. He gives talks on that now. He's long retired, of course, but there was a famous incident where he was flying. It was thankfully over the United States, but he was flying a U-2, and the engine cut out.
Yeah.
And so the engine quit, and of course those are huge. If you've ever seen a U-2, they're very long and skinny, and they fly very, very high.
Almost look like gliders, don't they?
They are gliders. So it's like the engine quit, but that doesn't. It's not like the movies where it just goes and then just crashes immediately. I mean, you could glide in one of those things unpowered for several hours.
Yeah.
So he had to bring that plane down to an Air Force base that could handle it. And that was a very, very touchy situation that could have been highly dangerous. And he managed to get through that. But those are the kinds of things that happen, and you never know when it could happen.
No.
So being having that in your family, and the other thing I think it's a little fictionalized in the movie, but the point is getting across is the angel of death guy.
Yeah.
We see
you're not sure if he's a lay preacher but he appears again and again, doesn't he?
He does, and that's kind of there wasn't on Air Force bases. There wasn't just like one guy who would do that, but that symbolizes the ritual of somebody. If there's an accident, somebody has to go and talk to the wives, and they usually know if somebody's coming up the walk.
Yeah,
frowning and looking very somber. That they're gonna have to give them bad news. And the scene with the one of the wives just cowering in the doorway, and she's saying, "Go away, go away."
Yeah,
that's so. Just the spirit of that is so accurate and so wrenching for anyone who's been in a military family.
I don't know if you've ever seen We Were Soldiers. It's Mel Gibson features in it, and it's about the 7th Cavalry in Vietnam in 1965, I think. Yeah, it is, in fact, the battle they took part in. It was the start of the Air Cavalry, and really the invention.
I think I saw it years ago. Yeah, years ago.
It's actually a really good film, and one of the things I like about it, very similar to The Right Stuff. It on the paper, on surface, it looks like a boys' action film, but they then look at the wives that left behind, and he's the commanding officer of the 7th Cavalry, and his wife sees a postman's going round delivering telegrams, Department of Defense telegrams, informing wives, "I'm really sorry, your husband has been killed in action, your husband is missing in action." And then she has a go at this postman going, how can you do this? And they had no setup, which I found surprising because they must have done in the Second World War. But for some reason, this was, maybe it just became, they thought it was being more efficient. But so she takes these telegrams from the postman, who is really apologetic, says, look, I'm a veteran myself. I'm sorry. I didn't want this job. I haven't got another job. And then she goes and tells the wives. But when they see her approaching, she becomes that kind of angel of death, and they're going, no, go away. And it's like, and you realise how horrible that must have been. And it was interesting, but as well in that scene with the barbecue back in The Right Stuff, where Betty Grissom says, when you marry a test pilot, you know what you're marrying into. You're marrying into the military and his career, but they owe me. And you get that feeling of, come on, where's the payback? Where do I get rewarded for supporting him and doing all the stuff that doesn't involve actually strapping yourself into an aircraft that's necessary for him to be able to go and do that? Yeah, it's very good. Sorry, I'm going to keep us here all night at this rate. Back to the movie, and we cut to Star City, Russia. It's October 1957, and we see sort of vintage footage of a space rocket taking off. In Washington, a man runs down a corridor. It's Jeff Goldblum. We never actually find out his name, do we? He's just referred to in the cast list as Recruiter. Right. There's two recruiters. There's him and his friend, who I can't remember. Oh, Harry Shearer plays him. They're a bit of a comedy break, aren't they, these two?
Yeah.
So he runs down, he bursts into a committee room, and President Eisenhower's in there, and this committee says, they've taken off. They're like, we know, sit down, shut up. And they put a film on showing the Russians launch their rocket. The committee are angry that they've been beaten, but a scientist comes in speaking a strong German accent. The president says, look, your idea of sending a chimpanzee into space is not acceptable. And then the Jeff Goldblum and Harry Shearer characters say, oh, we've had a look and we've got a film for you, sir, about people from professions we feel make suitable astronauts. And you've got acrobats, gymnasts, circus performers, people, high divers, all sorts. And I think one of them, there's a man being fired out of a gun. They said, oh, he's good and he can bring his own helmet. And President Eisenhower says, no, stop. No, I want test pilots. And all the other people in the room are like, no. And the scientists say, no, we can't work with test pilots. They're too arrogant and they won't listen. And he says, no. And he just puts his foot down and says, no, I'll have test pilots. So then we see, this is the scene we referred to earlier. They arrive at Edwards Air Force Base outside Pancho's Happy Bottom Riding Club bar, and they get their jackets mixed up, and Jeff Goldblum's tall and gangly and Harry Shearer's small and stocky. Chuck Yeager mocks the recruiters, saying they don't really want pilots, they want lab rabbits. But then we learn that actually Yeager wouldn't have qualified anyway because he doesn't have a college degree, so they've obviously got a set of criteria. But they sit down with Gordo Cooper and Gus Grissom, and they say, what is astronaut, or what's his job? And they say, no, it's being an astronaut. And Gus Grissom turns to Gordo and says, what does astronaut mean? He says, Star Voyager. He went, I like the sound of that. Then we see the recruiters are in the hotel watching TV, and they're watching Marine pilot John Glenn, who's just broken the coast-to-coast speed record, or time, distance record, for crossing the United States, continental United States in an aircraft. He's all in his medals, and he's, is it Name That Tune?
I think it is, yes.
He was on, yeah. And then the final scene of this little sort of sequence is we're on an aircraft carrier where Alan Shepard is landing a Skyhawk. He's played by Scott Glenn, and the two recruiters are trying to recruit him whilst being seasick. And we've got a little clip here we were going to play, and listening to what Alan Shepard says, who clearly was a heck of a character. We very briefly met him when we did Apollo 13, but it gives you an idea of the mindset of these guys.
Gentlemen, I'd like you to meet Alan Shepard. What? I'd like you to meet Alan Shepard.
What's the man we came to see?
Well, pleasure.
I guess you've heard about our project. We're going up against the Russians all the way. It's got the highest priority. It's a hazardous undertaking. In fact, it's extremely hazardous, if you get my meaning.
It's so hazardous that if you decide not to volunteer, it will not be held against you in any way.
Sounds dangerous.
It is.
Very dangerous.
Very.
Count me in.
So that was Alan Shepard being recruited, and obviously not at all hesitating. There's quite a bit to unpack there. The German scientist, Sean.
Yeah,
who was
the
it?
German guy was Werner von Braun, who was the former rocket designer for the Nazis in World War II. He designed the V-2 rockets, which were really the technological basis for ballistic missiles used in both really United States and Russia, the Soviet Union. So von Braun was brought to the U.S. after World War II. There was an operation, I think it was called, don't quote me on this, but I think it was called Operation Paperclip, where the American military, and this even started before the German surrender, where they tried to grab German scientists who had worked on the rocket program. And the Russians were also trying to do that, but they found it much harder. They had to use coercion. It's like, well, we think you should come with us or we'll kill your whole family, stuff like that. The Russians had to do that, where the Americans could afford to, bait them with less coercive means. It's like, we'll give you a great job and housing and make you an American citizen and, all these great things. So Werner von Braun.
And wasn't there, there's a great line in the movie at some stage where von Braun says, when they say, why are we being beaten? Have they got, their scientists better? And he said, no, our Germans are better than their Germans. And you realise this is all German scientists, like, as you say, being split by the Iron Curtain and working for their respective new bosses.
Exactly. One of the things many people remember from this film is that scene where the recruiters are showing the movie of like the circus performers and things like that. This is, I think, exaggerated. I did go back and check Tom Wolfe's book, and there's a very brief mention of this, but apparently it was not really that viable an idea, the idea that they were going to, in fact, work with test pilots was not a surprise, nor was it really that controversial. No. And one of the reasons was because they don't really get in the movie, they don't really get into the reasons, but the test pilots were all military. So their records were transparent. They already had records, whereas if they brought in civilians, they would have to vet them. And they already had security clearances and that kind of thing. So it was much easier logistically.
And you think about one of the very early scenes where they're trying to get a civilian guy to go for the sound barrier before it was first broken. And he's saying, well, I'll do it, but wow, it's going to cost. And they're saying, how much? And he wants $150,000. And then they approach Yeager and he says, yeah, let's do it. And they said, well, don't you want to ask, or what do you want to do or something? He said, well, what have you got? And then he laughs and says, no, I'm kidding. The Air Force already pay me. I'm getting a wage. So they're already being paid. They are subject to military discipline. They are, like you should say, they're already security vetted. So it kind of makes sense. But I guess the Jeff Goldblum and Harry Shearer characters are what we'd now call blue sky thinking. They're just sort of throwing ideas out there and seeing what sticks.
So I think, and one of the things...
Yeager was...
one of the things that I think this comes out of is Tom Wolfe, if you read the book, or if you read Tom Wolfe's other books, his writing style is a very kind of sardonic, almost like satirical kind of look. He wants to pick apart everything. So he's attracted to anecdotes that show kind of the bizarre side of it, or the weird, surreal side of it. So I think that's kind of how this got taken out of the book and brought into something in the movie. I mean, it's a comic moment and it's kind of fun, but
sure. Yeager was quite dismissive, I believe, of the whole idea.
Yeah. Many of that early generation of test pilots were, because they hammer this theme in the movie that the real pilots don't want to be involved in the astronaut program because they think they're just going to be superfluous, and they say, you want lab rabbits, not really pilots. That tension, tension gets played with a couple more times in the movie. Just one more thing on this bit. You mentioned Name That Tune. John Glenn was on Name That Tune, although I believe it was after his space flight. I think it was not before, as depicted here.
And if anybody, John Glenn, is he still alive now, or has he recently died?
I think he died just fairly recently.
because he was the oldest man to have gone into space.
Right.
He went up after this movie was made. He went up for a space trip, I think, to the space station.
Yeah, he did.
And they were looking at, would an elderly body survive it? And he said, yeah, I'll go. Heck of a character. And there's a clip on YouTube you can find. And whilst I don't condone violence, he's basically collared by a conspiracy theorist who says, why do you perpetuate the myth that people went to the moon? Why are you wrapped up? And he just punches him. And it's like this really feisty old man. He must have been in his 80s.
Was that
decks the guy?
Was that Glenn who did that, or that might have been Buzz Aldrin? I'm not sure.
Oh, was it Buzz Aldrin?
It could have been, but
I thought it was John Glenn, but
you maybe. I'm
and
not
also
sure.
the oldest man in space, I might be confusing with Buzz Aldrin as well, who's a similarly pugnacious, but sounds like a great character. Anyway, we'll find that out and let people know. That's a Simarata for our next episode. So back to the movie. February 1959, we see the astronauts in an Albuquerque clinic, and they're undergoing there's loads of little clips of them doing medical tests. Some look pretty gruesome, uncomfortable. John Glenn meets Scott Carpenter, and Alan Shepard is listening to Gordo and Gus and another Air Force officer getting quite cocky. And a clear sort of humorous character. Shepard winds them up, and there was obviously a character on television called Jose Jimenez, who does this sort of faux Mexican accent, and he's dressed as an astronaut. And nowadays, I think it would probably be seen as quite racist, but Alan Shepard's fascinated and thinks it's hilarious, his character. So he keeps putting his voice on, and he turns around and he's sort of saying, oh, the Air Force officers go in there looking like you, but when they come out, they look scared. And they just go through all these tests. And you can see this is a very, very competitive group of men.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this section is pretty accurate. There was a huge amount of testing going on, and they were just kind of throwing everything they could think of. I mean, it kind of looks from the movie like there was a master plan as far as all the tests they were doing, but I suspect that it was not as coordinated as the doctors were just like, well, let's try this and things like that. Interestingly, there's a documentary recently on Netflix called Mercury 13, which was about like there was a shadow Mercury program of women who were training to be astronauts. And they went through the exact same tests, and in many cases scored higher and did better than the men. But there was a resistance to, and they weren't being recruited by NASA. They were being recruited kind of on the side. But there was some resistance to the idea of women serving as astronauts, and in fact, John Glenn at the time was very much opposed to allowing women to become astronauts. So that's something about him that is not often known.
No, I suspect he would have viewed it as, being protective of the little ladies. Now, we'd find that incredibly patronising, but I guess he's a man of his, he's a product of the age he lived in.
Sure.
And I'm sure he he certainly wouldn't have said publicly, oh no, it's because they're, incapable or the competitiveness in that sense. I don't know. It's interesting that I didn't know about that Mercury 13 thing. That's a new one for me.
Yeah, interesting story.
Yeah. So back to the movie, we see, and this is a lovely scene. Gordo and Trudy Cooper are driving again on another, through the sort of shrub desert road. And they're now on their way to the newly founded space program, and he's basically given her exactly the same speech as he did on the way to Edwards, saying, no, this is the way to be, we're going to climb to the top of that tree. And she says the same reply as she did before. Well, what do you mean we? You, Gordo? No. And then he comes out with this line, which again becomes a bit of a trope through the, or a meme through the film of, come on, babe, who's the best pilot you ever saw? And then his punchline is, you're looking at him. So he's a charming and humorous lad and very cocky, but you do wonder if there's substance to him at this stage. Then we see President Eisenhower and his advisors watching a film about the selection process. That's intercut with the candidates undergoing more tests, and then they select their final 7. And at a press conference in Washington, we see all of them being introduced to the press and guests, and they announce them. and they're asking him questions. Some are a bit hesitant, but John Glenn takes the lead and proves himself to be a natural speaker and, we suspect, leader. But Gordo can't contain himself, and he interrupts John Glenn's speech. He gets a round of applause and a grin from Glenn, and we hear Handel's Hallelujah chorus playing, and the crowd stand and applaud. And then we have group photographs being taken of the astronauts, then their wives, then the astronauts with their wives. It's quite a powerful scene as we start to read the characters. But they don't seem to be antagonistic towards each other anymore, or at this stage anyway.
Yeah, I think they were pretty. I mean, there were antagonisms below the surface, as they show later in the movie, but I think they were fairly united. And I think this scene is pretty accurate. Of course, the film of the actual press conference, I've seen little bits of it, and from what I recall, they kept pretty closely to it. But I think there was a sense among them that they really were sort of representatives of the United States, and they had to pull together, and this was a race against the Russians, and they really wanted to put a good face on what they were doing as much as possible. So I think that's pretty accurate.
In the next scene, we learn that the astronauts, being military officers, aren't paid very much at all, and the government official responsible tells them, look, I'm going to authorise a substantial pay rise for you, and they seem pretty happy about that. Then we meet more of the wives, and they have a bit of a social get-together. Trudy Cooper turns to, I think it's Betty Grissom, and says, oh, that Annie Glenn, she's so ignorant, she didn't say a word. Then we see John and Annie Glenn together and realise that actually she has a really pronounced stammer and is very reluctant to try and speak to others in case she stammers. So it's not that she's aloof and standoffish, she's just very conscious of a speech impediment. And that's kind of, take us into the accuracy of that bit.
Well, we'll start with the stammer first. That is apparently accurate. She did have a stammer had it for most of her life, but later on in life, after her husband's space flights, or her husband's first space flight at least, Annie Glenn attended speech therapy, and it got markedly better. And in fact, she was able to do some public speaking later on in her life. I just want to go back a little bit to the scene, and I think it's with the Life magazine executives, and they're cutting this deal to pay the astronauts for their stories. And they don't really go into it in the movie. They do mention a couple of times that they're not paid very well and that kind of thing. Well, not only were astronauts not paid very much, but they couldn't get insurance, and particularly life insurance.
Wow.
The insurance companies regarded their jobs as so hazardous that they just refused to insure them. So the astronauts, of course, who all of them had families, they had to do something to try to get insurance. So what they did was a lot of them went on they cut deals like this Life magazine deal, but then particularly in the Apollo era, but also this era too, they went on various kind of money-making ventures to build up sort of a collective fund that would replicate the effect of insurance. So if one of them was killed, there would be a payout to their families from this fund. And the ventures that would generate the money for this fund were stuff like taking souvenirs into space and then selling them to collectors, particularly stamps. I don't know stamp collecting that well, but I know there's something called first day covers, which I'm not sure exactly what they are, but I know that they're very highly prized by collectors. So astronauts,
and if it's been into space, it's going to do nothing but boost it. Yeah.
Exactly. So astronauts would take bunches of stamps and envelopes and such into space with them, often, and like NASA would kind of allow this, or like sort of like it was not really allowed, but they would turn a blind eye because they understood the insurance problem. But there was this huge market in souvenirs and antiques and collectibles and that kind of thing. And we see a little hint of this later on in the film when, right before Gus Grissom's flight, he's playing with the little dimes and the little capsule toys that he says he's going to take with him. So this is a really interesting sort of facet of the astronaut program that a lot of people don't really know about.
No, that's it almost feels a bit, come on, NASA and Air Force and Marines and Navy, you could have said to the guys, right, you are going to get a gold-plated, if anything happens to you, your family will get a gold-plated pension for life, or, to make up for the lack of insurance. I never even thought about that.
Yeah.
Going back to the movie, we then see a series of rocket launches, each of which end in disaster. This is unmanned, of course, at this stage. The assembled astronauts are looking increasingly concerned as attempt after attempt ends in explosions and crashes. And this process takes months, we're told. Some of the astronauts later we see relaxing at Cocoa Beach in Florida. Alan Shepard's watching telly, laughing at this Jose Jimenez character, the spoof astronaut. Gordo Cooper, Gus Grissom and Deke Slayton are eyeing, these are the three Air Force lads who've been together from the start. They're eyeing up some local girls. And then we cut to the next day, and John Glenn is giving the group, in fact these two particular girls walk in, and I think Gus Grissom elbows Gordo Cooper and says, hey look, and they walk in and they say something like 3 down, 4 to go, as if these girls are basically trying to sleep with all 7 astronauts. A bit like stamp collecting, I suppose. But anyway, John Glenn the next morning gives the group a rollicking over their shenanigans, and we got a little bit of a clip here because I remember when I first watched the film years ago, back in around '83, and thinking, oh, well, they haven't explained that he was promoted to be the commander of the astronauts. Well, no, they didn't. This was John Glenn's morality coming out, and it will be Alan Shepard you hear tell him he's out of order. Anyway, we got a clip.
I don't want anything to put this program in a bad light. We have got the opportunity of a lifetime, and I'm sorry, but I am not going to stand by and let other people compromise the whole darn thing. You know, and I know this could lead to something very unfortunate.
What's ticking you off?
I'm talking about the playing around that's going on. I'm talking about the young girls. I'm talking about the cookies. I'm talking about keeping our pants zipped and our wicks dry around here.
Mr. Glenn, you are way out of line. I'd advise you not to try to foist your view of morality on anybody else in this group. Each man here has volunteered to do a job. Each man here is devoting long hours of training to prepare for it, and doing many things above and beyond the strict call of duty, such as morale tours of factories.
Such as bringing girls up to your room in the middle of the night.
And foregoing any semblance of an orderly family life. And Mr. Glenn, as long as a man uses good sense, what he does with his zipper or his wick is his own business.
Wait a minute. You got it all wrong. The issue here ain't pussy. The issue here is monkey.
What?
Us. We are the monkey.
What Gus is saying is that we're missing the point. What Gus is saying is that we all heard the rumor that they want to send a monkey up first. Well, none of us wants to think that they're going to send a monkey up to do a man's work. But what Gus is saying is that what they're trying to do to us is send a man up to do a monkey's work. Us, a bunch of college-trained chimpanzees. All right, so what Gus is saying is that we got to change things around here. He's saying that we are pilots. And we know more about what we need to fly this thing than anybody else. So what we have to do is to alter the experiment. And what that comes down to is who's going to control this thing from here on out.
What Gus is saying here is that we got to stick together on this deal.
So coming back in, so it was Gus Grissom who stepped in and said, no, we're arguing because we know there's a problem. And the problem is they're basically treating us like human lab monkeys. And that sort of hits the right note with the others. And actually, we see them starting to work out, staying fit. But then there's some brilliant editing. I understand why it got an Oscar for editing, because then we see a chimpanzee doing the same exercises. Wow. So, what can we unpack from that one?
Well, I don't know very much about the extramarital affairs. I believe that was covered in Wolf's book, but I don't recall what he said about it.
No, I read it shortly after I saw the film, but we're talking 1984-5. I probably read it, so my memory is hazy. Knowing military people in that environment, I wouldn't be surprised if things went on. Not all of them probably, but yeah. I think so. The rockets blowing up, that was pretty accurate. There was a long period where they just couldn't get rockets to work right, and they kept exploding and that kind of thing. The stuff focusing around Cocoa Beach was interesting. We first see it in this scene, and then later on, the Betty Grissom character calls it the worst beach in Florida. It has a really interesting history, and it was in this period, its economy, they call it the Space Coast now. Its economy was very closely tied to the space program because it's right near Cape Canaveral. There were also some problems with segregation in this era, where
African Americans were not allowed on the beach for a long time, and that kind of gave the place a bad name.
Right.
But really an interesting place, and it has also a place in the history of surfing. A lot of surfers came out of the Cocoa Beach area, and surfing really started to emerge as a cultural force really in the 1960s, like right after this time. And probably Cocoa Beach's most famous resident is Kelly Slater, the world surf champion, and he was from the town of Cocoa Beach and learned to surf on Cocoa Beach. So it's just interesting little trivia.
Wow. I'm afraid I'm not really up on surfing, but in fact, if you ever see me trying to surf, you'll understand that "up" is not a word that would be described for very long anyway. No, that's brilliant. Back to the movie, and Von Braun, the German rocket scientist, further aggravates the situation between the scientists and the NASA bosses and the astronauts by describing both chimpanzees and humans as occupants of our fully automated capsule. And things kind of come to a head when the astronauts get their first look at the capsule they'll actually go into space in. And they're looking at it and say, where's the window going to go? And the hatch with the explosive bolts. And they're told, no, this is the final version. And there's no window. I mean, it's basically they're not going to be able to see. And then we've got another clip now, and this is where things really come to a head.
Where are you planning on putting a window? Window? There's no window.
No window. What about the hatch?
The hatch?
Yeah, the hatch. We need a hatch with explosive bolts that we can open ourselves.
I think there is something you do not understand. This is the final form of the capsule. No hatch.
What would happen if the automatic controls went out?
Backups, checks, etc. This would not happen.
I said, what would happen if it did?
Pilot would have to fly it back.
This is the way it is.
You know, I wonder how the press is going to feel about this.
Press? What does the press have to say about it?
Yeah, what do they have to say about it?
Well, do you boys know what makes this bird go up?
Funding makes this bird go up.
That's right. No bucks. No Buck Rogers.
And, press over there. They all want to see Buck Rogers.
And that's us. Buck Rogers.
You see, those fellas over there, they've been making us out as the 7 finest and bravest pilots in all America. And if a story were to come out in the press that we were not being allowed to fly as pilots...
We want a window.
Yeah, there could maybe be, in future capsules, be a window or... Be
No, that's where the hatch with explosive bolts goes.
The hatch with the explosive... Yeah, there could be a hatch with explosive bolts on the capsule.
That is a spacecraft, sir. We do not refer to it as a capsule. Spacecraft.
Yeah, a hatch with explosive bolts on the spacecraft. There. And there will be pitch and yaw thrusters, which will enable the astronaut occupant
The pilot. Astronaut, pilot.
Yeah, the astronaut pilot. To have control of the re-entry procedures.
Thank you.
And as we've just heard, the astronauts use the power of the press and indirectly that relationship to funding to get their own way. The scientists back down, and then the assembled press are allowed in, and the astronauts all line up for some PR photos. But what's funny is the media then start to call out questions, and one says, who's going to be the first launched into space, to the astronauts? And we see Von Braun and his scientists looking at each other with barely suppressed smiles, because then we see a rocket launch, a capsule come down, splash down, and inside the capsule, alive and well, is a chimpanzee. And Chuck Yeager and his friends back at the Edwards Air Force Base are watching the TV, and they're laughing and repeating the spam and a can crack. But then we see Yeager staring at the moon outside a bit later, quite thoughtfully. So yeah, the conflict, I can imagine, is probably pretty accurate.
Yeah, I think it is. This is documented in Tom Wolfe's book, where there's continuing tension between the scientists, the designers, and then the astronauts. Although I had heard that possibly this conflict was overstated, that they really were kind of on the same side. They just kind of disagreed about the best way to go about the job.
Sure.
But certainly there's a public relations aspect to this whole thing. I mean, the whole thing was about beating the Russians, and that was a political objective and a public relations objective. So that, public relations had to be very much at the forefront of this effort, I think. Interesting thing about the chimpanzee, this is accurate. His name was Ham, and he was for an animal, had just a fascinating life. He lived until 1983. He was alive he was alive at the time of the film's production, lived in a laboratory. And in fact, Ham is buried at the Museum of Space History in Alamogordo, New Mexico. And in fact, he's buried in the parking lot, if you can believe it. There's a little monument to Ham in the parking lot. I've seen it, and it's pretty interesting. So, kind of
because Laika, the Russian dog, didn't survive, did she?
Right. Well, the Russians tended to launch animals into space and then just leave them there. That was
right.
So
Okay.
that was by design, because it's like, let's launch a dog into space and see how long it lives. Where the idea was to test, and you hear that from Wernher von Braun, where he says, well, with a human being, you have to guarantee a safe return. So they had to test whether they could bring something, someone back alive. I believe there were other chimpanzees who were also launched into space as well on various test missions, but Ham was easily the most famous.
Wow. No, that's brilliant. And good for him. As you said, one of the main thrusts of the space race, it was called the space race because the Russians and the Americans were racing each other, and we then cut back to Star City in Russia and vintage footage of Yuri Gagarin. They have been the first to launch a man into space. We see Jeff Goldblum running down the corridor again, bursting, going that it's Gagarin, they've got him into space, and again he's told, shut up, we know. And the American committee are meeting in some consternation. Meanwhile, the astronauts are gathered to meet the NASA management, and then the press attend, and the reporters are demanding to know how the Russians could have beaten them. And John Glenn fronts up and says, look, we should congratulate them. We just got beaten. Let's face it. But he's clearly putting a brave face on it, because as they move away from the press and they're walking off together, the seven guys, they're really not happy. They're going, how did we get beaten? And Gus Grissom, I think, and Gordo Cooper are swearing, and John Glenn, he can't quite bring himself to swear, and he's like, yeah, what you said, sort of thing. Then we cut to May the 5th, 1961 in Cape Canaveral. It's night, and a rocket's sitting on its pad. A newsreader tells the nation that they're finally ready to launch a man into space. The press have all been saying, look, we know it's John Glenn, because he's become the spokesman of the group. So it's a bit of a surprise when it actually turns out to be Alan Shepard who's been chosen to be first up. He's applauded aboard by the assembled NASA staff. John Glenn, in his uniform white, shakes his hand and gives him a grinning thumbs up, really enthusiastic. No visible disappointment that he won't be the first up. So you do get the feeling these guys have really bonded now. And then we hear Alan Shepard mutter, please God, don't let me up. You can insert into the whistle what words you can imagine he said. It's picked up by the radio, and Gordo Cooper in Mission Control, because they'd nearly always have an astronaut. We saw this in Apollo 13, and have a fellow astronaut at the other end of the radio, so it's a familiar voice. And he said, sorry, good buddy, I didn't quite catch that. Can you repeat? He went, yeah, everything is A-OK, comes the reply. Then at the Shepherd's house, and this is a really horrible scene. I mean, we think about the paparazzi today. They were no different. The press are climbing over a fence, trying to see Louise at the Shepherd's house. They're rummaging through her garbage, and they virtually attack the laundryman to go through her laundry, which was out for collection. And then the phone rings, and Louise is told by a NASA official that everything's fine, but there's been a delay in the launch. This caused a little bit of a problem. Alan Shepard needs to wee. The scientists say, well, we didn't consider this problem. It was only meant to be a 15-minute flight. And no, he's telling him to hold on because liquid inside the suit could cause a problem. So Gordo informs Alan over the radio. It's quite funny where he says, look, really sorry, buddy, you're going to have to hold on, but we guarantee we'll pull into the next service station and you can go then. And then a bit later, in a very clever scene again, Alan Shepard's in clear discomfort, and it's intercut with scenes of toilets flushing, coffee pouring, a stream gurgling over some rocks, and some other witty analogies. And finally, the scientists say, Gordo Cooper says, look, you're going to have to get him out of there. And that's going to be an hour, hours and hours of delay. And they say, go on then, he can just go in his suit. So he does, and some alarms go off on their monitoring equipment. But then Alan Shepard's kind of like, come on, let's light this candle. And this phrase is used by a few of the astronauts. The countdown commences, and by now it's daylight, and we see the rocket safely launch, propels Alan into space. We see the Earth from space, and for any listeners who aren't sure, it is definitely spheroid. And then the capsule starts its re-entry, floating down under a parachute. We then see the capsule, Shepard's been released from the capsule. He climbs out the rescue helicopter, and there's a US Navy band playing Anchors Away. Then you see him meeting President Kennedy, who's now the president. He's presented with a medal. The wives are talking to Louise, saying, oh, what was Jackie like? Oh, she was lovely. And the Shepards have clearly had a personal audience. And it's a really fast-moving series of scenes. So you just got to think, yeah, he's gone into space, boom, he's come down. The Navy have a band, everyone's saluting him, meets the president with his wife, gets a medal, boom. And a bit like Forrest Gump, really clever editing with, you're looking at JFK and the back of the real Alan Shepard, and then when it cuts the other way, in black and white vintage style footage, we've got Scott Glenn playing Alan Shepard. So it's very well done. Sorry, that I went on for a very long time there.
No, that's fine. There is a lot here. One of the things that I think is interesting and gets kind of glossed over by the movie is the difference between, or there was like kind of a progression of how the flights were supposed to go. And Shepard did not go into orbit. He had what they call a suborbital flight. So it was basically, and in fact, the Von Braun character explains this earlier on, where he says, yeah, he's going to go up like a cannonball and basically come down like a cannonball. So it's kind of really that human cannon effect, but at the top of the arc of the flight, you would technically be in space, even though you're not in orbit. So the steps were supposed to be, well, we're going to try that first. We're going to make sure we get that right, and then we're going to send somebody into orbit, and we're going to start sending people for longer and that kind of thing. And the Russians, when they sent up Yuri Gagarin, skipped that suborbital step. So they, of course, wanted to be first, and so they just went right for the chase. And they said, okay, we're going to put a guy in orbit, and in fact, they did. So it was a little disconcerting to the Americans that not only had the Russians beaten them, but they'd also skipped a step. So it wasn't, sure, are we still going to do the suborbital? Are we going to go, whatever. But I think that's kind of an interesting distinction. The story about Shepard needing to go to the bathroom, that is true. That's documented in Tom Wolfe's book. And I believe, I don't know the technical ins and outs of this, but I know that the interior of the spacecraft was pure oxygen. So they were very wary of anything that could cause a spark would basically cause that space capsule to explode, literally, kind of like the Apollo 1 fire that's mentioned at the very end of the movie. So that was the concern, but of course it didn't end up being, it didn't end up happening. But yeah, this is a
Seeing that scene the first time I saw it, it was just found it a funny scene. But watching the film again recently reminded me of my first flying instructor when I started the Army pilots course. We flew Chipmunks, old fixed wing, tail dragger, sit one behind the other. And our instructors were all retired elderly RAF gentlemen, most of them ex-fighter pilots. And my instructor, a chap called Robin, who'd flown Lightnings, which until the F-15 came along, the Lightning was the only aircraft that could go vertical and then go supersonic going up. Incredible thing. And he said they developed air-to-air refueling for the Lightning because it had a ridiculously short range or short endurance, like 45 minutes. And he said, unfortunately, they didn't develop comfort bags, relief bags, for the aircrew, for the pilots, until some time later. I said, well, what did you used to do? He said, you just used to go. And he said, the funny thing was, you could have he told me about a flight they went from Singapore to Cyprus, and it was like 9-hour flight with 6 refuels along the way. And he said, but you still find yourself, you're in the first hour and you need a wee and you're holding on. And you're thinking, why am I holding on? I'm going to have to let go at some stage. And he said they used to joke, and he said, if you see a guy walking along limping, he's a fighter pilot and his left leg shrunk in the wash. So that's the less glamorous side of being a fighter pilot. But yeah, I can imagine that the initial relief, lovely, interspersed with a bit of concern in case you're about to be, immolated.
Right.
But then it must very quickly become cold and damp and uncomfortable.
Yeah.
But anyway, back to the movie. We learn that Gus Grissom is next in line, and this is where you mentioned earlier, Sean, that this scene where he's got all these little toy capsules and he's chatting up the barmaid and saying, do you want one of these? Oh, I can get that from the dime store. He said, not one that's been into outer space, you can't. So he's going to go up, and as you said earlier, it's probably part of actually quite a calculated money-making scheme to replace the insurance they couldn't get. Then we see him going off to be launched. I was a bit surprised that they were having a drink the night before, and it looked like alcoholic drinks, him and Gordo, the night before he goes into space, but, they're different times, I suppose.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know about that. That seemed a little thick to me, too, but I'm just not sure.
The press repeat the performance of Betty Grissom's house, but she's very excited. Gus successfully splashes down in the sea, and then as the helicopter's approaching, it's talking to him on the radio, and he seems a bit jittery, and he's having some problems getting his helmet off, and he says, are you ready for me to blow the hatch? Are you ready for me to blow the hatch? And he has some trouble removing his helmet, and then viewed from outside the capsule, bobbing in the waves, we just see the hatch blow off, and Gus flops out into the water. I'm not sure his suit fills with water, but he looks to be in a bit of trouble. And the helicopter pilot's still trying to lift the capsule. Unfortunately, water gets in through the open hatch, water logs it, and the helicopter, it's a Sikorsky S-60, I think, the Wessex we called it in the UK, and it hasn't got the power to get this water-heavy capsule out of the water, so it has to cut it loose. The capsule's lost. Back on board ship, there's no band and no cheers. Everyone's just kind of staring at Gus. And he's then seen by a succession of doctors, each telling each of them, I didn't do anything. The hatch just blew. The hatch just blew. Then we see him before a board of inquiry saying the same thing. They say, okay, thank you very much, Captain Grissom, or whatever his rank is, and he leaves. And then one guy says, these explosive hatches have been on fighter aircraft for 10 years. They're subjected to tests by heat, shaking, submersion, being dropped from 100 feet, and none of them has ever just blown. Then Gus, Betty and their kids are at a modest reception, and it's actually hosted by the NASA project leader, not President Kennedy or even the Vice President. He gives Gus a medal, and Betty's denied her ambition to meet Jackie Kennedy, which is something she pretty much blames on Gus. Now, this is the one bit of real controversy that the film created, isn't it, when it came out?
Yeah, I think it was, and it was the controversy that was inherited from the book, really. The movie portrays Tom Wolfe's account from the book pretty faithfully to the way he writes it, but there's been some question about whether his account, how well that squares with reality. So if we are to judge the movie on its accuracy, we have to kind of give an allowance for the fact that it came from the book, and the book might not have been accurate. But the film seems to hint that Gus was responsible for blowing the hatch, and there was some question about that at the time. But even at the time, there were people, NASA engineers and fellow astronauts, who were pretty certain that his account was exactly right, that the hatch had just blown by itself through.
Right.
And there was, I mean, it didn't just, spontaneously explode. There was some cause for it. And I recall reading something about Wally Schirra, one of the other astronauts, triggered that exact same kind of explosion later, just to demonstrate that did happen. So,
well, the bottom line is we're never going to know. because the only person who'd know is Gus Grissom.
Right. And I also think that the film sort of conflates. We've got emphasis on the fact that there wasn't as much hullabaloo over Grissom's flight as there had been over Shepard's. He didn't get the ticker tape parade, and she didn't get to meet Jackie, but it really wasn't because people thought that Gus had, in the parlance of the movie, screwed the pooch. That really wasn't the issue. The issue was that it just wasn't as exciting as Alan Shepard's flight, because he had been the first, and then Grissom was doing exactly the same thing that Shepard had done previously. So, are we going to throw a ticker tape parade for that? I don't know.
And of course, this came out in Apollo 13, where leading up to that mission, you have the Tom Hanks, the Jim Lovell, was being told by the NASA guys, look, we've got to do something to generate TV ratings. People are bored of it. They just, people have been to the moon, people have orbited the Earth. It's like not that much exciting. And then, of course, Apollo 13 and that drama, that incredible drama that my parents talked about, hearing blow by blows on the BBC of wow, and that really gripped everyone and reinvigorated everyone's fascination with it, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's the second ever manned flight into space. You'd think that's very quick to go off the boil.
Yeah, true. Just one little interesting postscript about Gus Grissom, and this happened after the movie came out, but they actually did find the capsule on the ocean floor, and it was raised in 1999. And when it's now on display in a museum, but when they examined the capsule, in fact, they found some of the dimes that he had brought on board that were referenced in the previous scene. So they actually, when they brought up the capsule, actually found some of those. Pretty interesting.
Yeah. I mean, that bit about him taking stuff up with him to be able to sell, saying, look, this has been in outer space. Spot on. Back to the movie, Gus and Betty are in a hotel room. He tries to put a brave face on it, saying, well, look, they filled the fridge, and he starts drinking a beer. Betty doesn't come across well, because she does come across as a bit sort of demanding, and I wanted to meet Jackie, and then reminds Gus and us that all those years being a fighter pilot, then a test pilot's wife, waiting at home for him to come back and get a phone call, you realise, do you know what, she's actually got a point. Outside, the press arrives, they put a brave face and answer questions, and then back at Edwards base, I tried finding a clip for this, and unfortunately I couldn't, but Yeager and his mates are watching a TV report, and the assembled pilots and staff are slating the astronauts, going, oh, they haven't done anything monkeys haven't done, and then they're sort of going, spamming a can, and I think they all look at Yeager and expect him to join in. He says, hang on a sec. He said, a monkey doesn't know it's sat on top of a rocket. It takes a special kind of man to volunteer for a suicide mission, especially when it's on TV. Oh, Gus, he did all right. And it's really heartwarming, I think, that scene of, no, look, come on, we've taken the mickey out of them enough. This is a dangerous thing they're on. They've all volunteered. These are brave men and deserve a bit of credit for it. So I quite like that scene.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting observation, especially after we had seen previously Yeager kind of dismissing the whole thing as lab rabbits. I think
that's a follow-up maybe from when they were laughing at the chimpanzee having come back down safely, and then you see Chuck Yeager's gone outside on his own, and he's just stood there staring at the moon, and you wonder if he's wishing he had a college degree and he was 10 years younger. I don't know.
Yeah,
but
indeed.
I think maybe it shows the process he went through of, hang on a sec, okay, I've taken the mickey. I don't really want to be doing what they're doing. I'm happy doing what I do, but let's cut them some slack.
Yeah, indeed. Just the one scene in the hotel room. This is another scene that strikes kind of close to home for someone from a military family, and the Betty Grissom character comes off, played wonderfully by Veronica Cartwright, wonderful actress. Most science fiction fans will know her from Alien, the original Alien movie. But and interesting little tidbit about her. Her first role, she was a child actress, and she was one of Beaver Cleaver's classmates in Leave It to Beaver.
I have no idea what that film is. I'm afraid
it's a very famous TV sitcom from the 1950s. In America, I don't know if it ever reached your shores, but certainly American viewers will be familiar, at least with the concept of it. But Veronica Cartwright was on that. But anyway, she comes off as kind of materialistic and shrewish, but yet she makes a very good point. And she says, they, meaning the military, they owe me because they have done all this stuff to us, and you're never there, and there's all this danger and all of these risks that she didn't sign up for when she married him, and certainly their kids didn't. You can say of someone who volunteered for the military or volunteered for this mission, well, it was your choice to do all this. You took this on your shoulders. But the military wives and military children, they didn't volunteer. I didn't have any choice over whether my dad was going to crash in a U-2 or whatever. It's like that had nothing to do with me. And so her feeling that the dependents of military dependents are really owed something by the military, that they serve every bit as much as the service person themselves. I think that's a very valid point.
And also, I don't think Gus endears himself as very much, because at the peak of Betty getting really upset, and she's not having a go at him, I think she's just having a go at the situation. He says, "Oh, well, anyway, I've got to go beer call with the guys," and you're like, "What?"
Yeah.
And then it's interrupted by the press coming out. But it's strange that the movie does. Fred Ward does a great job. There's something a little bit shifty about Gus Grissom, the way it's played, and yet earlier in the argument in the cloakroom, he's the one who cut through all of it and said, "Hang on a sec, we're all arguing about niff-naff and trivia here," and he was one of the people who would apparently have gone off with one of these girls the night before. But he doesn't try and defend that. He just says, we're missing the point. The problem is that we're being treated like lab rats or monkeys. So I think there's probably a lot more to the real Gus Grissom than the movie shows. And I'm not criticising the movie because it's following, as you said, Tom Wolfe's book. But yeah, anyway, back to the movie. As President Kennedy announces a new stage to the space race, we see the dusty old bar at Edwards base on fire, and then we see it. Chuck Yeager rides up on his horse the next morning, and it's gutted, and we sense that the times they are a-changing, as Mr. Dylan once sang. John Glenn's on the phone, being told that the Russians have sent a man up for a day, and they want to launch. He's at home. I think he's woken up by the phone. They said, we want to launch as soon as possible, but we have had some problems with the rocket we'll need to use because we want to put you into orbit. And he's unhesitating. He says, we're ready, 100%, which is pretty much his stock-in-trade answer to anything. Then we see the usual press pack scrummage outside the Glenn's house, and we learn that the Vice President wants to speak to Annie. Now, of course, we know that Annie's got a really bad stammer. Trudy Cooper's with her. In fact, all the wives are together again. Trudy Cooper says, do you want to speak to him? And she stammers, no. And Trudy just turns down to the official. And Trudy Cooper was brilliant in the scene. And blooming heck, I've forgotten the name of the actress who plays her. It's back in my earlier notes. But she's really good. She just turns around and goes, no. And you get that sense of, no, you're not getting past me. She don't want to talk to you, so you can say what you like. Then we see LBJ in his car shouting at his guy who keeps going up and asking if the Vice President can speak to Mrs. Glenn, and then all the press are running off, and his lackey says, I think the flight's been cancelled. He says, perfect, I can be on television commiserating at her disappointment. We cut back to the cap shuttle, to the space rocket. John Glenn's being escorted out. He's looking frustrated. He's with Alan Shepard. And then we cut back to LBJ getting angry and says to his official, get hold of her husband and make sure that he tells her to speak with me. So the NASA boss approaches John Glenn, who's obviously not in the best of moods anyway, says, can you speak with your wife? And he's like, what? Yeah, sure. So anyway, John gets on the phone, and we got a clip here, and I quite like this.
Annie? It's me. Are you all right? Tell me what's wrong.
Johnson wants me on...
Vice President?
Tell her to let him in with the networks, John. It's coverage, you know. It's important, John.
Annie, listen to me. Are you listening? If you don't want the vice president or the TV networks or anybody else to come into the house, then that's it, as far as I'm concerned. They are not coming in. And I will back you up all the way 100% on this, and you tell them that. Okay? I don't want Johnson or any of the rest of them to set as much as one toe inside our house.
Okay.
You tell them that astronaut John Glenn told you to say that. All right?
Yes.
I'll talk to you in a little while.
Can't do that, John. It's the vice president, the head of the program. You're gonna think of the broader interests of this program.
You are way out of line here.
I'm out of line?
Yes, sir.
I'm running this show here.
We'll see about that.
Yeah? And I'm thinking of changing the order of flight assignments.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah.
Who you gonna get?
Who am I gonna get?
You heard what he said.
That's right.
So that was John giving his backing somebody 100%. Stout chap. And you can see the power is very much shifting to the astronauts camp. And I love the bit where the NASA boss is raging. We just heard him saying, we're going to change the flight sequence. And the rest of them are like, really? Who are you going to get to go?
Yeah.
And you can, and the actor, again, sorry, I should know all this. The guy who plays the NASA boss, he's a veteran actor. Everyone will recognise him. His shoulders just sink, and he's like, "Oh God, yeah,
Yeah.
I've got nowhere left to turn."
This is
so. All this stuff with LBJ and everything. How is that? How did that go?
This is apparently true. This is documented in Tom Wolfe's book, and it did apparently really happen. LBJ was really mad. I mean, he was just absolutely livid and did not understand what was going, because he was a politician, and when he was vice president, he had run for the Democratic nomination in 1960 and thought he would get it, thought he should get it, and kind of accepted the vice presidency as sort of a demotion for political reasons. So when the space program came along, he sort of saw that, he latched onto that as his thing, and it's like, well, this is going to be my ticket to succeeding Kennedy. Of course, he did end up succeeding Kennedy, but in a much different way. But I love this. So he was very much in trying to get press attention and TV attention connected with the space program. I love the actor who plays LBJ here. This is Donald Moffat, is the name of the actor.
Yeah.
When we were watching this last week, my husband said, he's the best movie LBJ. And I said, yeah, I think you're right. Because we've had various other actors play Johnson, most recently Bryan Cranston. Michael Gambon actually played LBJ in an HBO movie called Path to War, which was John Frankenheimer's last film, which is another film you should do on the show. But
right.
But Donald Moffat is just he captures like LBJ's unpleasantness so great, and he's pounding the sides of the car, and he's like, is there anybody who can deal with a housewife? And it's just absolutely so perfect. So this is one of my favorite scenes in the movie.
Yeah, it really was good, and again you get that Ed Harris absolutely intransigent. No, you're not doing that.
Yeah, exactly.
And I don't care.
Exactly.
Pamela Reed was the girl. That was the
Right.
actress who played Judy Cooper, and she was brilliant in this scene. She's again, I am Annie Glenn's wall, and you are not getting through me.
Right,
Go away.
right. And there's almost a callback to this in Apollo 13, where the reporters want to build the equipment on Mrs. Lovell's lawn, and she's like, no, and if you got a problem with that, you can take it up with my husband. And it's like that's almost an homage to this scene.
Yeah, definitely.
Just
the guy who.
Yeah, I'm sorry. One quick thing that I just wanted to mention before we move on. There's the scene where the Pancho's bar burns down, and this is way out of time in the movie. Actually, Pancho's burned down in 1953, long before the astronaut program began. So this is kind of out of out of sequence. And actually, it may have burned down. Pancho had a long-time dispute with the federal government over the real estate that place was on, and there was this mysterious fire that may or may not have been connected to that dispute. So there's a lot to that scene that's missing here.
Right. Okay, I guess it's not the focal point of if anyone makes a movie about Pancho Barnes, who sounds a fascinating character,
actually,
then maybe we'll.
Yeah, actually, they did. There was a TV movie in the late '80s about Pancho Barnes. I didn't see it, but but I came across, as I was researching this, I came across mention of it, and I'm like, oh yeah, I remember that that being a thing. So.
Incidentally, the guy who plays the NASA project manager is John P. Ryan, and he's another of those faces that but I would imagine a lot of people, unless they're real, movie buffs, wouldn't actually know what his name was, but you recognise his face.
Yeah, he was the guy.
Anyway.
He was the guy who gets handcuffed to the train in Runaway Train.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, not a film I've seen.
Great
not
movie.
sure that's one we'll be doing, but
It's not historical, but it's a great movie.
Yeah. Oh, great. And it was Kim Stanley who played, sadly no longer with us, she played Pancho Barnes in the movie. Kim Stanley was the actress. As people probably guess, I just brought IMDb up and looked at the cast list. So, back to the movie. We now cut to Mochi, Australia. It's February the 20th, 1962, and Gordo Cooper's going down. He's heading for an observation station in preparation for John Glenn's flight, as he'll be flying several orbits of the Earth. They think they're going to send him up for about 7. And when he goes on the other side of the world from NASA, they're not going to be able to talk to him, so Gordo's job will be to pick up the comms. Gordo meets some Aboriginal men, and he's shown an elder who they say he also flies in the skies. And he's going to be praying for you. He's going to be helping you. And Gordo's like, suits me. I'll take any help I can get. So John Glenn finally gets a successful launch, and it's one of the most amazing sequences of the movie. It's so beautifully done, as he's just going, whoa, wow, and he's talking to Alan Shepard on the radio. He said, you're good to go for at least 7 orbits, and we get more of Bill Conti's amazing score as he's looking down and he's taking photographs. He works out he's travelling at 17,000 miles an hour, and each day's lasting about 20 minutes, it seems. It's like day, night. And he sees the moon, which is much larger than he's used to seeing, then a night full of stars. Gordo's down in Australia, and he starts talking to him as he goes across the southern half of the globe. And then John can see lights on the ground. He said, I can see lights in Australia. He said, well, the good people of Perth and Rockingham have turned the lights on for you. And he says, be sure to thank them from me. And I don't know if that's accurate or not, but do you know if they... I'm guessing it's a sort of detail that would be so well known, particularly in Perth and Rockingham, that it's probably true.
It probably, yeah, I don't know for sure, but it probably is. I know that there were some NASA stations specifically in Australia, and the purpose of them was to be able to pick up communications while the spacecraft was on the opposite side of the world from Houston. So there was certainly NASA activity in Australia. I know there were Australian stations that were prominent in the moon landing missions as well for that same reason.
Ah, right, yeah. No, that makes sense though, because it's line of sight, and you don't really want to lose comms with your capsule, especially when things go wrong. And back to the movie, down in Mission Control, a red caption light saying landing bag deployed. And we learn that this may mean the heat shield has come off, and if this is the case, John Glenn and his capsule are going to burn up on re-entry due to the incredible heat created by the friction of re-entering the Earth's atmosphere at these kinds of speeds. John calls Mission Control, meanwhile, not being aware there's anything wrong yet, and he tells them that he appears to be surrounded by glowing particles like fireflies, and he finds it amazing. He said, could they possibly be alive? And the scientists exchange looks, and you can guess that they're slightly worried it might be something breaking off the capsule. So John takes some pictures of the lights as Alan Shepard looks tense. Now, there were lights, weren't there? But they're not connected to the landing bag deployment or anything.
Right. The fireflies that he sees, in fact, it was named for him. It's called the Glenn effect. But they really aren't as mysterious as portrayed in the movie. In fact, they were particles of frost or little particles of ice that were illuminated by the sun, and they were released from the attitude control jets on the capsule. There's a little bit of dialogue exchange here where it sounds like they rule out that possibility, but that was in fact what it was. So,
right.
So that was, and it was named, and it's been seen on numerous other space missions as well. But it does come from the spacecraft itself. I just want to say one other thing about Australia, especially if you have the IMDb list up. The old Aboriginal guy who does the fire, and I love it stylistically in the film. They conflate the sparks from the Aboriginal fire with the Glenn effect. It's a beautifully edited scene, but the old man is an Aboriginal actor, and then there's a younger guy who appears earlier in the scene, and he's the one who's like, oh, not me, man, that guy. I don't recall what their names were, but both of them.
The only one listed on IMDb is David Gulpilil.
Okay, yeah, he was the younger one, but both of those guys were in a film called The Last Wave. I don't know if you've seen it. It's not historical, but it was Peter Weir's next film after Picnic at Hanging Rock, and it's a super interesting film. It's actually it can be read today. I don't know if it was intended at the time, but it can be read today as an allegory for climate change. And it's about environmental catastrophe that is foretold in Aboriginal prophecy. But both of those guys that are in this scene had prominent roles in that film. And I just thought that was interesting.
Well, David Gulpilil was in Rabbit Proof Fence and Crocodile Dundee.
Yes, that's right.
And Australia, the movie Australia, 2008 movie.
Which is terrible, by the way.
Yeah, I remember hearing that it was pretty dreadful.
Yeah.
It's so hang on. So back to the bit about the. I mean, again, we got this fantastic editing of the movie. The bits earlier where Alan Shepard needs to go to the toilet, so you see a close-up with a very clear sound of someone pouring coffee from a percolator, gurgling into a mug, and then again, like you say now, with the lights. It's really well done, and they captured, as they did in Apollo 13, that real sense of, wow, you're in space, yes, it's your job, it's your mission, and, but, I mean, I'm not sure I would have volunteered if I'd been in the situation to be invited to volunteer to get launched on my own into space. It'd be like,
yeah,
not sure about that one.
That's a hard call.
Of course, now we've got to the stage which we covered first in, I think it was episode 8 on Hidden Figures, where they were computing the angle they had to bring John Glenn back in. And before he went, they were saying, look, if you come in too shallow, you'll bounce off and you'll head out into space and you'll die when your oxygen runs out. And if you come in too steep, you're going to burn up. And that was before anything went wrong. So, some of these movies we've done are kind of coming together quite nicely. The NASA boss turns to the room. This is back to the movie. And he says, come on, what are we going to tell John? And Alan Shepard's absolutely unequivocal about it. He says, he's a pilot. You tell him the condition of his craft. So they say, okay, we might be able to keep the retro rocket pack in place rather than jettisoning it. If the straps hold, it would give the capsule some heat protection. Now, these straps aren't, fabric. I guess they're, something in metal, I suppose, and very, very strong. Shepard says, look, we think we may have a problem, but believe at this time there will be no problem with a re-entry of this type, i.e. keeping the rocket pack in place. I mean, John Glenn's just incredibly calm and methodical about it, and he initiates the re-entry process. He's only done 3 orbits. He shows his nervousness by humming to himself. One of the scientists in mission control says to Alan Shepard, what's that noise? He said, that's right, he's humming. He does that. And again, you get the feeling these guys are so close to each other, they know each other's little habits and foibles. The capsule experiences incredible heat, and it's basically a fireball heading for the ground, and the radio cuts out as he passes through the upper layers of atmosphere, so Capcom have to wait, but they know that. And Shepard keeps calling, but there's no reply, and I think he's humming the Battle Hymn of the Republic. But anyway, suddenly we get a ticker tape parade. Bands are playing the Battle Hymn of the Republic, and John and Annie are in an open-top car, and she's finally got LBJ's finally got to meet her because he's in the open-top car as well, and we know it's all okay, and they've got back. He's got back safely, and that's all pretty much bob on, isn't it?
I think it is. Glenn was really a hero when he made this flight, and there was a tremendous amount of enthusiasm and a sense of triumph among Americans because we had finally gotten into orbit, and this was the distinction between the suborbital flights, which were Shepard and Grissom, and then the real orbit flights of Glenn and everyone else who came after him. So in a way, it's like Glenn was not technically the first American into space, but he was the first to orbit the Earth. And there was a huge public outcry. It was and he was often compared to Lindbergh flying the Atlantic in 1927.
Yeah.
And it was that kind of level of ballyhoo. And all the stuff about the landing bag and the tricky re-entry, that is accurate so far as I know. I wasn't really sure what they weren't really sure that it was a real problem. It might have just been an instrument that was giving them a false reading, but they weren't going to take a chance. So that's why they did that.
Back with the movie, we get now cut back to Edwards Air Force Base. I assume we're still at Edwards with Chuck Yeager, and they've got this new supersonic fighter, and they're saying, look, the Russians have recently done this altitude record, and we reckon this could do it. But the budget is being slashed. If you want the big bucks, you've got to go to the space program. That bit for me, I'm just going to quickly jump across to a bit of reality. I'm not convinced that NASA and the Air Force would have had anything to do with each other's budgets. Okay, any government only has one big eventual pot of money, but I think that's a little bit of setup. Then we cut to the astronauts being welcomed to their new home in Houston, Texas. LBJ's making a speech. Obviously, he was a Texan. He's wearing a cowboy hat. Lots of people are wearing cowboy hats, and there's horse riders and barbecues and rape-tricking cowboys. And then the astronauts are shaking hands and meeting local dignitaries. And there's a little bit, and Alan Shepard turns to his wife and says, I'm going to the moon, which is a little bit sort of out of left field. And then Gordo is talking to Gus, and he says, do you know what? I'm on this big wage packet now. I've got a fully furnished house. I get free meals right across the country. And I haven't even been into space yet. And then Gus Grissom, he sort of laughs, and we realise that Gordo's the next one due to go up.
Yeah, I think this is such an interesting sequence here. This is the opening of what would eventually be called Johnson Space Center after LBJ. And from what I could tell, it was officially opened in September of 1963, which was after Cooper's flight, but I don't think that's necessarily inaccurate because there were temporary operations there, and from what I read, there was this big gala. It was not at the Space Center itself, but it was a big arena in Houston, which is where we see all of this, the huge, the vat.
It's like a marquee, isn't it?
It's incredible, yeah. And there's like the vats of barbecue sauce and like a whole pig being roasted, and my husband being from Texas, I have dabbled in this culture as well, and it is not an exaggeration when they, especially when LBJ says, we're going to welcome them Texas style, and this is the kind of spread that you would have. I've always been baffled, though, by this scene here, and we're going to be going into the next scene in just a minute with Yeager, but that's kind of intercut. But there's this whole thing with the fan dancer. And I never really understood what that was supposed to be symbolizing, and the fan dancer actually is supposed to be Sally Rand, who was a famous burlesque dancer from the 1920s and 1930s, and she was famous for that fan act that she did, and she was actually still performing at this time in the early 60s, but I never understood.
Wow.
Yeah, I never understood. So she I don't know whether she was actually there at this celebration, but she certainly could have been. But I never really understood what the purpose of this was in the movie, and it seems to go on for so long, and it's like, he could edit this down a bit.
I mean, it's a long movie. It's 3 hours and 13 minutes, and this is one of the scenes that does kind of drag a bit. But then we cut back to Yeager, and he takes off in the new fighter jet, and no one seems to be expecting him to go flying, and the two guys in the tower are like, have you got anything for this? He says, no. Well, and he calls up with his call sign like, well, it's Colonel Yeager, we can't really say no. So he heads for the stars, trying to beat this recently set Russian altitude record, gets into trouble and has to eject. Now he lands safely, but he's pretty beaten up, and the ambulance heads across. Now I thought it was Scott Crossfield in the ambulance, but anyway, there's another pilot aboard with the medic, and they drive out to meet him, and he's walking towards him, and he's in pretty bad shape, but he's on his feet. Then we learn that it's May the 5th. In fact, let's just deal with that, with the last bit of Yeager, because that flight wasn't unauthorized, was it?
No, it's kind of silly the way they depict it, and I don't know why they did this. Maybe just to show like Yeager's gravitas within the military or whatever, but they would not have let anybody go out there and take an unauthorized spin in this plane. I think this is the F-104 is the plane, which was super. Yeah,
it's the Starfighter, or the Flying Coffin as it got christened.
Yeah, so the flight clearly was planned in advance. It was part of a test program. And then we've got the character here of Ridley, who had been in the breaking the sound barrier scenes. He wasn't there. Yeah. He actually was dead. He died in 1957 in a plane crash in Japan. So they call back the line, hey, you got any Beemans or whatever, just I think for continuity. But this was really a bad thing for Yeager. And it doesn't, at first it's not clear when he bails out and you see him falling and like his suit is smoking, and then later on when he shows up and he's walking and his whole face is all burned, and it's not clear what caused that. Well, what happened was that he was burned when his ejection seat had like a rocket on it to propel it away from the plane, and he was just opening his chute and he got entangled, his parachute got entangled with the seat that was still floating away with the rocket burning, and it like burned a blast of oxygen right in his face.
Youch.
So he was badly burned, and he had to have skin grafts, and this is talked about. He's talked about it several times. It's talked about in his autobiography, and there's various other accounts of him talking about this accident. So it was a really, really bad accident, which I think is portrayed fairly accurately, at least the accident itself.
I think it's a press officer he's talking to at the beginning of this series of scenes, who says, the budget's been cut. He said, but then of course if someone could do something to bring attention back to us, like, take on the Russians at this altitude record, and it's sort of like he's egging him on to do it. But everything I've read by and of Chuck Yeager, that is not his character to go, and he'd have gone and argued quite happily for permission to do it, but I just don't believe he would. He wasn't a maverick,
right? Yeah,
he was an experimental test pilot, sure. So he did a lot of stuff, but I think he was very much a team player.
Yeah,
I don't think he'd have done that. So I just thought it was a bit. Come on. But Sam Shepard, great performance. He whether he resembles Yeager in mannerisms or looks is a matter of opinion, but he certainly captures that sort of spirit of the pioneer.
Yeah, yeah, I think so.
So back to the movie, we learn it's May the 15th, 1963. It's Gordo Cooper's turn to fly, and this is another of the themes we've not really mentioned up to now, but he's obviously one of these people who can just fall asleep wherever he likes, and he's actually in the capsule awaiting the launch sequence, gently snoring. So John Glenn wakes him up and says, hey buddy, we've got a launch sequence to do. And then we go through the launch sequence, he takes off, and there's this classic line, which I believe he genuinely came over the radio, and as the sun streams through his window, he just says, oh Lord, what a heavenly light. Now, it's the look of childlike amazement and delight on his face. It's wonderful. And Dennis Quaid he's one of those eternally youthful people, I guess. Or he certainly was in '83. It's a lovely scene, but then almost brutally, a narrator says the Mercury program was over. 4 years later, Gus Grissom, along with 2 other astronauts, were killed when fire swept through their Apollo capsule. But on that day, in 1963, Gordo Cooper flew 22 orbits around the Earth, and he was the last American to go into space alone. And that is the end of the film. Wow.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that they end with the mention of Apollo 1 because we mentioned the movie Apollo 13 several times, and I think you can almost see Apollo 13 as a sequel to this.
Yeah.
And Apollo 13 begins with a description of the Apollo 1 fire in 1967 where Grissom was killed. So I think that's an interesting continuity between the two. And you're right about Dennis Quaid. He was terrific in this role. His career has had some ups and downs since then, but I think he'll always be remembered for this role. And he did get that kind of like, he was the perfect fighter jock and that sort of childlike exuberance when he takes off. And my dad has said that just the experience of flying and of being up there is kind of so magical for some people, and that's why they're driven to do things like this. So I think they captured that pretty well in the final scene.
Definitely. We traditionally, Andrew and I at this stage, will give it a mark out of 10 for entertainment and a mark out of 10 for historical accuracy. On entertainment, for me, this film is a 9. And it has remained at least a 9 every time I see it. And I've probably seen it this is probably the 4th time in my life. Saw it at the cinema when I saved up enough as a young soldier in Germany, bought a video player, a VHS player. I got a video cassette, then I got it on DVD, lost it, and I've just recently got it again. It doesn't seem available on most of the main streaming services, which Amazon just says currently unavailable.
Yeah,
so
that's crazy.
I'm not sure if there's some kind of copyright thing, but a classic like this, you'd have thought this has got Netflix written all over it. But
sure, yeah.
At the moment, no, but I bought it on DVD, very cheap, and definitely one for the collection.
Yeah.
And I really, really enjoyed it. So, marks out of 10 for entertainment. What are you up there, Sean, or are you?
Yeah, absolutely. This is a great film. I think one of the best films of the 80s. And I think it kind of has an interesting stylistic affinity with the 80s. On my blog, I did, more than a year ago, a series of like the most iconic films from the 1980s. And I picked this one as one of them. So entertainment value, definitely, 9 or 10. It's tremendously entertaining and really just interesting. And it's been talked about by critics and by film historians as some of probably the best like flight type footage that's ever been portrayed in a movie. Because you can really, especially in those scenes like the breaking the sound barrier and various other the airplane related scenes, you can feel the speed coming on. And
that sense of awe of John Glenn looking down on Earth, thinking, wow, this is so cool. And I'm thinking, wow, that must be so scary. And I guess to him it's not.
I think you're right about the pilot mentality. As you were saying that, what came to mind was the much more recent event involving Captain Sudberger, who saved there was an airliner that went off. I don't remember exactly what happened. I know
Hudson Bay ingested some geese.
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
Shut the engines down.
And he was
he's been criticised by some people have gone into simulators for that aircraft type and said actually he could have made it back.
Yeah.
And it's easy for you to say in a simulator where if you find out you can't make it back, it doesn't matter because you press reset and have another go.
Right. Exactly.
He had to make a decision. At the end of the day, everybody got off safely.
Yeah,
I don't see there's a problem.
And it was amazing because he was rightfully lauded as a hero at the time that happened. But he said exactly the same thing. It's like, I just used my training. This, we were trained to deal with this. I knew what to do. We did it, and it worked, and that was it. So it's not like, he was Superman saving all these people. That was the effect of it. But for him, it was a mission that he had been trained for. He knew what to do, and it worked out. It worked out perfectly. And so pilots do have that mentality. And again, I alluded to the story where my dad went down in a U-2, and it's like that was the same thing where it's like he knew what to do. Okay, he couldn't start the engine. Okay, now what do we do? Okay, well, we find an airport, airfield, and he went through all the thing and got it down. And that's really what pilots do, and their training takes over. So
entertainment, I think we're both hitting it with a big healthy 9. Accuracy, I think probably 8, because there's an awful lot that's right. We generally let films off for time compression for narrative purposes. The Chuck Yeager bit at the end is a little bit jarring, and there's the uncertainty about Gus Grissom. But to be fair to Philip Kaufman, the director, and the movie, they don't say it was Gus. They leave us to make our own minds up. I just think the setup is a little bit always getting jittery, and we don't really know that he did.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's right, and I think 8 is about right on accuracy. The major story they got pretty much right. There's a lot of interesting little details that they got very right, and then kind of the reason I was brought in to talk about the spirit of military life, and particularly the relationship of wives and family to military careers. They got that absolutely so right that I've never seen it portrayed more accurately in any other film I've ever seen. So I think it deserves some points for that.
Ooh, I might push it to a 9. No, I think it has to stay at 8.
Yeah, I think so. Just for the Gus Grissom
8's
stuff.
8's a good score.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you ever so much for joining us, Sean. It's been an absolute delight, and we probably going to try and get you back. We have actually done a couple of films which would have fitted the second decade, In the Heart of the Sea, about the sinking of the SS Essex, the whaling ship by the sperm whale in the Pacific. Film's not great, but the story is absolutely fascinating. But we've done that one, so I'm going to now look for anything that's second decade or climate related. Unfortunately, I don't think we can do The Day After Tomorrow, because it's not very true.
No, that's quite a bad thing in the climate change milieu. People talking about, and that story came from Art Bell, who was a paranormal radio host in the 90s, and Whitley Strieber, whose claim to fame is his claim that he had been abducted by aliens. So not the best guys to listen to on climate change.
Yeah. He wants to be careful if he accuses Buzz Aldrin or John Glenn, whichever one it was, because they got a wicked right hook on them. So thank you so much. Wish you all the best with your projects. Please do try and get another episode of the second decade out soon.
Yeah, absolutely.
Especially Antarctica. I know so little about it. Apparently it's quite cold there at this time of year.
Yeah.
And every other time of year. But very much looking forward to that. And we do hope that we will have you back on again soon, but we will definitely follow you with interest. And thank you so much for being such a great guest.
Thanks a lot. It's been a great pleasure.